Racial inequality, gender inequality, two glaring realities exposing the unfulfilled goals of America. Almost 250 years ago, the United States Constitution declared all men are created equal, a truth that has not yet been realized in our country as our country continues to struggle with bringing equality to all people. There is no excuse for inequality today, and we must understand that our universe declares every human equal in value and rights. And yet inequality, ethnic violence, racial injustice, and bias play out in our world daily. Our issues today, let's be clear, are due to personal and political agendas, hundreds of years of dialogue seeking to describe certain people as superior to others, and basing this dialogue on bad science. What went wrong? People were led to believe that race was a biological construct, when in reality, race is a cultural, social construct. The idea of race is alive and divisive due to the self-interest and fear of oppressive people. Let's see how this beautiful universe debunks the idea of inequality. Today, we explore our genetic makeup to understand there exists a minute difference between all humans. In fact, genetically speaking, we are all 99.9% the same. The difference in skin color, hair, face, and a few other surface level variations are the result of some genes activating more than others. And based on those differences, we categorize people into undeserved boxes. It's crazy. In episode 1, we decided to pursue meaning instead of meaninglessness. This meaning will reveal itself as we've continued to study the characteristics of the universe. We summarize this as truth number 1. There is a superior being who wants to be known as the Christ. Episode 2 explored the unbelievable power exhibited throughout the universe, which allowed us to conclude benevolent protection and creative anticipation define the true nature of power and of Christ. Episode 3, we discussed how the universe shows we are loved and the extravagance of that love, and we concluded with this: we are loved so we can love. For this episode, we will focus on racial prejudice to show the absolute absurdity of not believing every human is equal in value and rights. The concept of race began in the 1400s. Eastern Europe, tired of being raided by slave traders, fortified their cities against attack and dramatically slowed the sale of Eastern Europeans as slaves to Western Europeans. The slave traders turned their focus to Africa and expanded the exploitation of Africans to satisfy the demand for free labor in Europe. Portugal led the way in establishing trade routes for slavery, and the king commissioned an historian to rationalize the new and almost exclusive practice of capturing and enslaving Africans. Gomez de Ains Zurara provided a rationalization of why it is good to enslave Africans. Zurara wrote that people from Africa were inferior to all other humans due to the beastly way they lived and their lack of education. He concluded that slavery was an improvement for these Africans because they would be introduced to Western Europe culture and Christianity. Yeah, I'm sure that's what they felt. And suddenly we have two races, one consisting of black people from Africa and the other one, everyone else. The idea of race culminated in the bad science of Samuel Morton in the early 1800s. Morton collected hundreds of skulls from around the world and measured the size of the craniums to understand the volume of brain that could be contained within each skull. The skulls were put into 4 categories, and the categories ranked for intelligence according to skull volume. Morton and others reasoned that the larger the brain, the more intelligent the person. Morton's measurements led to him to state that 4 races existed and labeled them Caucasian, Asian, Native American, and African. Morton proclaimed that Caucasians had the largest brains and were thus the most intelligent. The Africans had the smallest brains and were the least intelligent. Morton's contemporaries immediately pointed out the poor methodology of his work, citing oversights such as not taking into consideration gender, body size, and geography, which all influence the size of individual skulls. Unfortunately, his conclusions were widely accepted. In fact, his conclusions supported people wanting to rationalize slavery throughout the Civil War. Morton's view of people still exists in minds today, despite the extensive gains science has generated in understanding the genetic makeup of humans. This view of inequality based on the science of race is simply not true. This new understanding began in the mid-1900s when UNESCO proclaimed there was no scientific basis to classify human beings into race. UNESCO's statement shows great wisdom and clarity, which science of the past 70 years continues to support with new insights. These quotes from the June 1950 issue of UNESCO's magazine drive home this truth. From the biological standpoint, the species Homo sapiens is made up of a number of populations, each one of which differs from others in the frequency of one or more genes. Such genes, responsible for the hereditary differences between men, are always few when compared to the whole genetic constitution of man and to the vast number of genes common to all human beings, regardless of the population to which they belong. It went further to say, the biological fact of race and the myth of race should be distinguished. For all practical purposes, race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. The myth of race has created an enormous amount of human and social damage. This was in 1950, 70 years ago, and they still ring true today. Obviously, racism blocks our ability to achieve meaningful, authentic lives. Science continues to prove the idea of race is wrong. The Genome Project in the early 2000s contributed the scientific data to show that all humans share 99.9% of the same genetic material. And within this 99.9% of genetic sameness, we all have our own fingerprints, the pattern of our retinas is specific to each of us, and even the shape of our ears is unique. In a less unique way, our skin color varies from light to very dark. Our hair has a variety of textures that are variations of our shared genome and basically skin deep. None of these skin level features speak to the value of individuals or populations. A National Geographic project studied the historical patterns of DNA for more than 830,000 people from 140 countries. As we now understand, there are genetic markers within each of us that are specific to different populations from different parts of the world. To show the ignorance of classifying people by race, National Geographic chose 6 people who had the same overall, very similar DNA ancestry and similar geographic backgrounds. When you look at these 6 people from the genetics numbers perspective, you see they are all the same. Yet when the 6 were revealed via their photographs, they all looked extremely different. Some of the 6 identified themselves as black, some white, some mixed race. And yet they were difficult to tell apart from their genetic structure while looking physically dissimilar. Why is this so? The ability to trace the historical patterns and geographies of the genetic makeup leads scientists now to believe that all of us today are descendants of a small group of Homo sapiens in Africa. Over time, migrating populations constantly mixed and eventually separated by continents. This continental separation brought about DNA mutations around skin color, which made populations by geography visually similar to each other. And yet, the continental groups compared to other continental groups did not show specific markers that characterize one continent from the other. What we call races within these continents do not have distinct, unifying genetic identities. They don't exist. Let me share 2 more specific examples of how our shared genome manifests itself around the globe. 3 genetic scientists, 2 Americans of European descent and 1 South Korean of Asian descent, worked together on a certain genetic project. During the scope of the work, they each had their individual genomes mapped and realized that each American scientist had more in common with the South Korean scientist than they had with each other. Again, the idea that race does not accurately describe a person. A serious blood disorder called Varigate Porphyria, found throughout the world, is particularly common in South Africa. Until recently, most people considered this a disease due to race. However, advanced genetics now show that this disease can be traced to a single white Dutch couple who married in Cape Town in 1688. Thus, being a South African is not a risk factor. Being a descendant of the Dutch couple is. What seems like something race-related is due to ancestry and geography. Thus, the universe teaches that we are all equal, for we are genetically the same, and that race is invalid in describing people groups. Geneticists now use terms like ancestry instead of race to describe common backgrounds of populations, which scientifically is much more correct. Also, these different ancestries cross over every skin color and prove that skin color has no impact on the value of a population or an individual. For this part of our journey to meaningful living, we now see that our own hearts and prejudices are the basis for racial injustices, misunderstanding, and inaccurate characterization. Our problems with human equality come from our history of human beings forcing themselves as superior over others for their own selfish gain. Unfortunately, no amount of good science will end racial inequality due to the social structures we have built. This is why spirituality is so important. We must be willing to look within ourselves and see what fears and prejudices we hold to break down and end racism and uphold the truth that all people are equal and valuable. So truth number 4, all people are created equal in value and rights, and Christ is the originator of equality. Paul reminds us of this when he says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ." So for homework this week, I encourage you to do the hard work of identifying the prejudices you hold in your heart. Why do you harbor these prejudices? Why must you hold yourself above others? How can you and I change our hearts as we consider the equality Christ established with us, the human race? Next episode, we will look at the obstacles and the solution to inequality. Remember to follow Reconsider Christ on Instagram for timely reminders of what we are discovering and experiencing throughout Season 1. Peace.